On the morning of Monday, March 24th, 1986, 46-year-old Julie Williams finished up getting ready for work in her bedroom in Mesa, Arizona, and as she did, she couldn't stop smiling. When she was done, she took a final look in the mirror, then grabbed her purse and headed outside to her car. And as she made her 20-minute morning commute to the city of Tempe, where her office was, she saw other people heading to work. And she saw businesses and shops opening up. And this made her smile just keep getting bigger. Julie had been working as a secretary at an insurance agency for the past several months, and she actually loved going in every day. It wasn't that she always dreamed of working in insurance or anything like that, but for the first time in years, Julie had started to feel a real sense of purpose and peace at her job. Because Julie had dedicated most of her life to this point to being a mother to her 3 daughters. She'd stayed at home in California, where she'd lived while the girls were growing up. She stayed home so she could look after them and cook them dinners and just be there for them all the time and give them the best life they possibly could have. Julie's daughters were everything to her. Now, Julie would not have traded that time with her daughters for anything in the world. She didn't regret it at all. But now, her daughters were grown up, they were married and even beginning families of their own. Once all 3 of them had officially moved out of the house, Julie really struggled. She didn't really know how to live without them. It was like now that she was an empty nester, she didn't know what to do. And to make matters worse, following her kids leaving, she and her husband got divorced. So she really was beginning to feel lost and alone. But Julie had decided she would just have to make some major changes to basically save her life. And so she had moved from California to Arizona, where one of her daughters lived, and she had set out to start the next phase of her life, which she was determined to make a happy one. Just before 8 a.m., Julie turned off a road in Tempe and pulled into the parking lot of a large office building that housed several businesses, including the insurance company where she worked. She parked her car and headed to the front door. She pulled her magnetic ID badge out of her purse and swiped it across the card reader that was just to the side of the door. She heard the lock click open, so she walked inside and headed down a hallway to her company's office. This particular branch of this insurance company was rather small. Julie was one of only 5 employees there. But this small office had played a major part in helping her start this new phase of her life. Julie liked the job and got along well with the few other people she worked with. But most importantly, working here had helped Julie realize she could be independent and that she could have goals for herself that had nothing to do with taking care of other people. And this realization had already inspired Julie to do other things on her own. She'd started making new friends and going out with them on the weekends, and she'd become an active member in her church. Inside the office, Julie said hello to a couple of the other employees who'd also just arrived. And at some point, one of her coworkers, named Deborah Grisham, waved to her and came over. And the 2 women began chatting about their weekends as they headed to the break room to put on a pot of coffee before beginning the workday. But just a few minutes later, Julie's coworker, Deborah, rushed out of the break room with a concerned look on her face. She saw Julie running down a hallway, and she called after her if Julie needed help, but Julie didn't respond. The other 3 employees saw and heard Deborah calling out, and they immediately got up from their desks and came over to see what was going on. But Deborah just shook her head like she didn't even understand what was happening. She said that she and Julie were talking in the break room making coffee, and then all of a sudden, Julie said she felt sick and dizzy and just took off running down the hallway towards the bathroom. Deborah said Julie looked really bad, like something was genuinely wrong with her. From the hallway, Deborah continued to call out to Julie to see if she needed anything, but she didn't get any response. So she and another female employee went into the women's bathroom. And when they stepped inside, they immediately began to panic. Because through the crack under one of the bathroom stall doors, they could clearly see Julie slumped over on the floor. Immediately, Deborah and the other woman ran to the stall, but they couldn't get it open. And so the other employee, so not Deborah, she dropped to the floor and crawled under the bathroom stall door. And when she actually got a good look at Julie, she immediately shouted to Deborah to call 911. About 15 minutes later, Officer Sue Scoville of the Tempe Police Department was driving through the city in her cruiser when she got a message from dispatch. A woman had been found unresponsive inside of a bathroom in a nearby office building. There wasn't much information other than that, but dispatch said paramedics were already on the way. Officer Scoville said she'd head right over to the office building, then she turned and hit the gas. As Scoville drove, she began to run through a series of statements in her head, like she was repeating some kind of mantra. And what she was saying to herself was basically every step she had been trained to take when she arrived on the scene. Because Officer Scoville was not experienced. She was actually a rookie cop. And even though there was really no expectation that she would fully understand what she was walking into, I mean, she didn't, and nobody would, she still wanted to make sure that when she got there, she followed procedure and did everything just right. So, as Scoville sped towards the office building, she kept repeating those steps over and over, and then when she arrived, she jumped right into action. Scoville walked into the big business building and made her way over to the insurance agency. And there, at the door, she saw 4 employees, and all of them looked like they were completely in shock. Just before Scoville had arrived, she'd received word that paramedics had arrived at the scene and taken the woman who had collapsed to the hospital. And so for all Scoville knew, this woman might have just had a heart attack or some other medical emergency. But in the office, Scoville cycled through the steps she would need to take in her head once again, and then began taking those steps. She asked the employees who the woman was who'd collapsed, and exactly what had happened that morning prior to calling 911. Deborah said the woman who had been taken to the hospital was Julie Williams, a secretary in the office. Deborah said Julie had arrived at work that morning at about 8, like she always did. Officer Scoville asked if Julie had seemed okay when she first got there. Had she seemed sick or maybe looked like she was physically struggling in any way? But Deborah just shook her head. She said no, Julie seemed fine. They'd talked about their weekends and gone to the break room together. But then Julie took a sip of water, got this weird look on her face, and told Deborah not to drink any. Then, before they could do anything else or say anything else, Julie said she felt sick and turned and ran out to the bathroom. Scoville took down some notes and then asked Deborah to lead her to the break room. The break room was a small, brightly lit room with a sink, a refrigerator, a lunch table, a coffee station, and a water cooler. Officer Scoville walked over to the water cooler. It looked like any normal water cooler in a typical office break room, but she already had a hunch. She asked if anybody else had had a cup of water that morning from this water cooler. And when she said that, Deborah had this really surprised look on her face like she'd completely forgotten something huge. And she said, "Me. I got water earlier. But as soon as I tasted it, it just tasted strange, and so I had spit it out and dumped the water down the drain." Officer Scoville didn't waste any time. She told Deborah to step out of the break room and to make sure nobody else came in there. Deborah nodded and walked out. Scoville still wasn't sure what was going on here, but she now had a real fear that the water in that cooler had caused Julie to get sick. And if that was the case, this might not be just a natural medical emergency. So Scoville radioed into the station and said they would need a detective on the scene right away. Later that morning, veteran detective Mike Palmer of the Tempe Police Department walked into the insurance agency and immediately met with Officer Scoville. In his 8 years as a detective, Palmer had gotten this reputation on the force for having what they called a sixth sense. He could just tell when something was off. Other police officers said he could arrive at a scene and see things that nobody else could see, like an entire crime would just come to him in a vision. Now, Detective Palmer kind of laughed off claims like that. As far as he was concerned, the sixth sense people talked about was just him being hyper-observant and trying to ask the right questions. He told Scoville that he had called the hospital before he left the station, and he learned that Julie Williams, their victim, was in a coma. And based on an MRI and CAT scan, doctors already feared she would never wake up. They said she had gone into cardiac arrest and suffered brain damage, but at this point, they still didn't know what the cause was. Scoville told Detective Palmer all the details she had gotten from Julie's coworker, Deborah. She told him that Julie had supposedly gotten a drink from the water cooler right before she passed out. And before that, Deborah had apparently tried the water, basically barely sipped it, but said it tasted funny and had just spit it out right away. Palmer put on a pair of gloves, and he and Officer Scoville headed to the break room. Palmer grabbed a cup and he filled it from the water cooler, and the smell immediately hit him. He told Scoville that her hunch about the water being bad was definitely right, because he said this cup of water had a distinct almond smell. He would need to bring a forensics team in and get the crime lab to run tests to be sure, but he was confident that that smell could only mean one thing. The water in the cooler had been contaminated with cyanide. Cyanide is a highly toxic and potentially deadly chemical. It can be found in liquid and powder forms, and sometimes it can give off a distinct odor that smells a lot like almonds. But even when that's the case, not everyone can pick up this almond smell. But Detective Palmer, who people already believed could see more than other cops, had smelled it right away. Palmer stood up, poured out the water, and started searching the rest of the kitchen. And when he got to the coffee station, he saw something that further supported the idea that cyanide had been used in here. The empty coffee pot had this strange crystalline residue inside of it. Palmer suspected this meant that cyanide had also been poured into the coffee pot. And the mugs that were sitting next to the pot also had a light coat of the same residue inside of them. So it seemed to him like whoever did this had been trying to poison basically any drink somebody could have possibly gotten in this break room. Palmer told Scoville that there was no question in his mind about what had happened here. They were dealing with an attempted murder. Somebody had tried to make sure that Julie Williams, or somebody else, or maybe everyone at the office, was going to ingest cyanide. Detective Palmer quickly radioed in that he needed a forensics team and several more officers on the scene. Then he walked out of the break room and found Julie's coworker, Deborah, and he had one simple question for her. When was the last time the coffee pot and the mugs in the break room got washed? Deborah said she knew that everything had been cleaned when she had left the office for the weekend this past Friday evening. Palmer had shown up here not knowing if he was walking into a crime scene or a medical emergency. And while he was still trying to get his mind around how or why somebody seemed to have poisoned the entire break room, Deborah's comment about things being washed on Friday enabled him to see a clear timeline of events. If Deborah was telling the truth, that meant the coffee pot and mugs had been contaminated potentially with cyanide sometime after Friday evening after work and before 8 a.m. this Monday morning. To Palmer, this likely meant that whoever had done this had come into the office over the weekend and poisoned everything with cyanide then. Deborah said as far as she knew, nobody from the office had come into work over the weekend. However, the whole building did have a weekend cleaning crew that would have had access to the break room, and also there had been a construction crew working inside the building all weekend too. This made the list of people that Palmer would have to potentially track down a lot larger than just Julie's coworkers at the insurance agency. However, Palmer had noticed there was an ID card reader by the building door when he came in, and he thought that that reader would at least make identifying some of those people a bit easier. So, when the rest of his investigation team arrived, he sent several other officers to track down a list of every ID that had been used to access the building since Friday evening. However, because this was 1986, compiling a list from an ID reader was not a fast, simple computer function like it is now. And so Detective Palmer knew that data collection like that would take some time. He also told his team to get the names of the people on the construction and cleaning crews that had been there as well. Palmer hoped that all of this would point him in the right direction. Because as of right now, Palmer had no idea who the intended victim or victims were supposed to be. But he assumed it clearly had to be somebody at the insurance agency. And if Julie hadn't been the target, or at least not the sole target, he feared that others could still be in danger. Within hours of Julie being taken to the hospital, Detective Palmer's team was tracking down names of people who had weekend access to the building, and a forensics unit began a full sweep of the break room. And while that was happening, Detective Palmer met with the other employees, and things quickly took a turn. The first employee he spoke to was a man who was clearly upset about what had happened. He said he just didn't understand, because everybody loved Julie. She was like a nice mom who looked out for everyone else. But when Palmer approached the desk of a 29-year-old woman named Diane Harry, she did not look upset. Standing next to her was a man who she would say was her husband, Lewis, and apparently after she had found out what happened to Julie, she had called him, and Lewis had rushed right over to be with her. Palmer understood that, but from his perspective, it just seemed like Diane and Lewis appeared to be in a total panic, like as if they were the ones who had been poisoned. And so Palmer asked them, hey, why are you guys this upset? What's going on here? And Diane at that point would chime in and say, actually, that's an easy question to answer, because she believed somebody was actually trying to kill her. This surprised Detective Palmer, so he actually took a seat near Diane's desk and said, okay, what do you mean by that? And Diane said that both she and her husband Lewis were being threatened by a very dangerous man. And so Palmer asked them to please tell him everything they could about this man. Diane immediately shot a look over at Lewis, He nodded, and in a low voice, he told Detective Palmer that this had all started a few months back, when a friend named Verbrae Wooten had come to him for help. He said this woman, Verbrae, had been in a relationship with a man named Roy Fitzpatrick. But when she'd broken things off with Roy, he got mad. Verbrae had tried to stay away from Roy, but he began stalking her. Verbrae was really scared of Roy and didn't know what to do. Lewis had told her she needed to go to the police, tell them what was happening, and at the very least get a court injunction that would legally force Roy to stay away from her. Verbrae followed Lewis's advice, and Lewis said he had hoped that that would be the end of it. However, within days, a letter had shown up at his and Diane's house, and it was from Roy. And in this letter, Roy threatened that if Lewis didn't step away from this situation with Verbrae, well, Roy would do something to him. And within days, more letters from Roy began showing up, and they were increasingly more and more threatening. And in the final 3 letters they received, Roy said things like since Lewis had ruined his relationship with Verbrae, he would do the same thing to Lewis by getting rid of Diane. Detective Palmer was shocked. He still hadn't written off the idea that Julie Williams, the woman who was fighting for her life in a coma, had been the intended target. But there was no way he could ignore that Diane and Lewis seemed to have someone bent on doing them harm. So he asked Lewis if he would go home and bring those threatening letters back so we could take a look at them. Lewis said he would. He said they had actually held on to them with the intention to bring them to the police, but they had held off in fear that, talking to the cops might somehow make things even more dangerous for them. But, given what's happened to Julie here, it was clear they'd waited too long. Once Lewis headed out to get the letters, Palmer asked one of his team members to get all the background information they could on Roy Fitzpatrick. In the meantime, Palmer met with the forensics team, and they said he'd been right. They were sure cyanide had been poured in the water cooler, coffee pot, and the mugs. And one forensic tech said he thought there was enough of this deadly chemical in the break room to kill 150 people. It didn't take Lewis long to return, so Detective Palmer sat down again with him and Diane and quickly read over the letters that Lewis had brought in. There were 7 in total. A few were handwritten and a few were typed. And they definitely got progressively more threatening, just like Lewis had said. As clear as it was that Roy now had to be considered a major suspect, something still didn't quite make sense to Palmer. How could Roy have gotten into the office building over the weekend? He didn't work at this building, and so he did not have an ID card. But, there was a chance that he might have just crept in unseen with the construction crew or cleaning crew or anybody else that just happened to come in over the weekend that did have a badge. Palmer asked Diane and Lewis if maybe Roy had any connection to the insurance agency or to any of the other businesses on site in this building. Lewis said he wasn't sure, but he knew Roy worked for a company that did deliver packages all over Tempe, so maybe that was enough to allow him access to the building without being noticed. On the morning of March 25th, so one day after Julie was rushed to the hospital, Detective Mike Palmer sat inside of a small interview room at the Tempe police station, reading over the letters that Diane and Lewis had supposedly received from a friend's angry ex-boyfriend, Roy Fitzpatrick. Palmer had barely slept, but he still felt energized. In the course of just a day, this case had gone in a totally different direction that he never would have predicted. He also now had confirmation from the hospital that Julie, who was still in a coma, had indeed ingested cyanide. And even though Palmer now did have doubts that Julie had been the intended target, regardless, she was the victim of this crime. Palmer didn't want to forget that, and he wanted to get justice for her and her family as quickly as possible. Just then, the door opened and a uniformed police officer led Roy Fitzpatrick into the room. He told Roy to take a seat across a table from Palmer, and then after he had, that officer stepped out. Detective Palmer slipped the threatening letters into a file folder and then took a good look at Roy. Palmer's first impression was that Roy looked more annoyed than nervous. In fact, Roy said he had no idea why he was there. So Palmer started right in with his line of questioning. He asked if Roy had ever gotten violent with his ex-girlfriend, Verbrae Wooten, either when they were together or after they had broken up. Roy shook off the question. He said they'd argue like couples do, and maybe he yelled sometimes, but that was it. So Palmer followed up by asking if Roy had ever sent any threatening letters to Diane and Louis Harry. And at that, a very confused look came across Roy's face. Without missing a beat, Detective Palmer opened up that file folder and slid the letters across the table and asked Roy if he had written them. Roy looked down at the first letter sitting in front of him and he said, "I didn't send that." But Palmer didn't buy it, so he kept pressing. And pretty soon, any attitude that Roy had walked in here with completely dropped. Roy apologized for lying, and he began to shift uncomfortably in his chair. He admitted that he had sent Lewis and Diane some letters. He blamed Lewis and that stupid court injunction for his ongoing problems with Verbrae. But he said the letters were just posturing, a way for him to sort of get out his anger. He said he would never actually do anything to hurt them. Detective Palmer and Roy spoke for a bit longer. As incriminating as the letters seemed, Palmer knew they were not nearly enough for him to hold Roy for now, because without any real evidence linking Roy to the crime, it would be a big leap from someone writing threatening letters to poisoning an office break room with cyanide. And Palmer had been a detective long enough to know that a district attorney would not take on a case against Roy at this point. So at the end of their interview, Palmer told Roy he could head back home. But he shouldn't be surprised if he soon found himself back in this room. Following the interview with Roy, Detective Palmer called the hospital, hoping against hope that they might have some good news about Julie. But those hopes were quickly dashed. Julie's condition had not improved at all, and doctors feared she actually wouldn't be alive much longer. The call with the hospital really made Palmer mad. Nobody deserved what happened to Julie, but the fact that she might have just been the victim of some insane plot that had nothing to do with her just made things even worse. Even though it had only been one day so far, Palmer was determined to keep moving quickly. He sent members of his team to keep pressing building security for the names of the people who'd swiped their ID badges at the building over the weekend, and he sent others to start interviewing the construction and cleaning crews that had been there as well. And by early afternoon, Detective Palmer's desire to close this case as fast as he possibly could got even stronger. Because news of the poisoned water cooler had gotten picked up by local reporters and by popular morning radio DJs in Tempe. And this had quickly sparked a panic in the city. People in every office with a water cooler wondered if their water could also be laced with cyanide. And Palmer knew rumors like that could lead to chaos if they didn't get quashed fast. And so, while Palmer waited to hear back from his team, he went back over the notes he'd taken during the past 24 hours. Roy remained his primary suspect, but Palmer still didn't know if this man who'd been angry enough to threaten Lewis and Diane would go so far as to actually indiscriminately poison an entire office break room in the hope that, Diane might get killed in the process. Palmer reread Roy's letters, and when he did, something stood out about the final three, the ones that were by far the most threatening of all of them. And so as he wondered what to make of them, Palmer decided he would track down the woman who appeared to be at the center of all of this, Roy's ex-girlfriend, Verbrae Wooten. Just hours later, Palmer sat down with Verbrae inside of an interview room at the station, and he made it clear to her that she was not in any trouble. He was just trying to understand her relationship with Roy. And Verbrae said a lot of the same things that Diane and Lewis had said, that she and Roy dated seriously for a while, but when she broke it off, Roy started harassing and threatening her. And she regretted that, she knew she played a role in getting Lewis and Diane dragged into it as well, because she was pretty sure Roy had begun stalking both of them. Now, none of this was new information to Detective Palmer, but Verbrae's testimony did reinforce the idea that Roy had the motive and the means to commit this heinous crime. But before Palmer wrapped up the interview, Verbrae said something that Palmer couldn't ignore, and it set his mind racing. And within minutes, just from this small piece of information, Detective Palmer thought he knew exactly how the break room poisoning had gone down. This was one of those moments that led other cops to believe Palmer possessed that sixth sense. Detective Palmer let Verbrae go and hurried back to his desk to continue to look over his notes. Now, despite what his colleagues might think, Palmer would never assume his hunch on something was 100% correct without hard evidence to back it up. But right now, even though he did feel really strongly that he had a hunch how this went, all he could do was wait, because that hard evidence he needed wasn't something he could just get on his own. Late in the afternoon on the following day, March 26th, Detective Palmer was at the station working the case, as he'd done for almost 48 hours straight, when a member of his investigative team rushed in and headed straight for him. The officer handed Palmer several sheets of paper, and said that they were the record of all the badges that had been swiped to open up the building from past Friday evening until Monday morning, right before Julie was rushed to the hospital. There were a lot of names, but Palmer immediately began scanning over the pages, and quickly, he found exactly what he was looking for. Palmer rallied his team and said the information about the IDs almost sealed the case in his mind. But there were a couple more pieces of evidence he was sure were out there that would make their case airtight. So Palmer and several other investigators rushed out of the station and headed across town. They arrived at a small office, and Palmer and his team combed through all of it, hoping to find those final pieces of evidence. As Palmer rifled through a bookcase, he found a notepad. He picked it up, flipped through the pages, and then shouted for his team that he had found one of the things they had come for. A few minutes later, one of Palmer's investigators crouched down on the floor and began digging through a trash can, and he suddenly froze. This officer completely trusted Detective Palmer's instincts, but he still couldn't believe he had found this object just sitting in the trash. He grabbed it in his gloved hand, stood up, and held it up for Palmer to see. And for the first time in 2 days, Palmer felt like he could finally just take a breath. Because between the ID badge report, the notepad in Palmer's hand, and now this object the other officer had found in the trash, Detective Palmer didn't just know what happened to Julie Williams. He knew what happened, and he had evidence to back it up. And just as Palmer was getting ready to move in on a suspect, he got word that Julie had passed away. So now he had a murder case on his hands, not just an attempted murder. Based on the ID card report, evidence found at the crime scene and other locations, and interviews conducted over the investigation, this is a reconstruction of what police believe happened that led to Julie Williams getting poisoned. Just after 10 a.m. on Saturday, March 22, 1986, 2 days before Julie was rushed to the hospital, the killer drove slowly through the streets of Tempe, Arizona. The killer wanted to make sure they didn't speed or do anything that might attract attention, because sitting in the passenger seat was what appeared to be a nondescript cardboard box, but inside it held a container of cyanide. The killer pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, but they didn't move. Instead, they scanned the exterior of the office building right in front of them. But all they saw were a couple of construction workers taking a break outside, so basically nobody was around. The killer took a steadying breath, then climbed out of the car, walked around to the passenger side, and grabbed the cardboard box. With the box, they headed to the front door of the building, making sure not to rush. If those construction workers or anybody else saw them, they didn't want to stand out in any way. The killer reached the front door and swiped an ID card over the reader. The door unlocked, and the killer made their way inside and down the hallway to the insurance agency. When they stepped inside the insurance office, the killer looked around, making sure nobody was there. But it was all clear. So the killer went to the break room and put the box down on the floor right near the water cooler. Then they grabbed the large water bottle on top of the cooler, trying hard not to spill any water or make any kind of mess, and they managed to turn the large open bottle over and set it on its base on the floor without spilling any. Then, they carefully opened up the cardboard box and pulled out a large, unmarked plastic bottle. They unscrewed the cap and then grabbed a scooper they had brought out of the box and used it to begin to scoop up the powdered cyanide from that bottle and dump it into the water bottle. They used far more cyanide than they figured they would need to kill someone, but they didn't want to take any chances. Finally, when they were done, they carefully picked up that big water bottle, now laced with tons of cyanide. They raised it up, flipped it over, and put it back on its spot atop the water cooler, again without spilling any water. The killer exhaled. They'd gotten through what was by far the hardest part of their plan. But they still needed to move quickly and get the rest done and get out of that building as quick as they could before anybody saw them. So the killer carried the cyanide bottle across the break room and set it down near the sink. Then they grabbed the clean coffee pot as well as some clean coffee mugs, and they sprinkled more cyanide into all of them. Once the job was done, the killer left the coffee pot and the mugs by the coffee machine, put the cyanide bottle back in the cardboard box, scooped it up, and now at this point they just wanted to get out of there, so they just ran out of the building back to their car. A few minutes later, the killer arrived back at their house. There, they hid the box until they could discard of it later, And they also slipped their spouse's ID badge back where they had taken it from without their spouse ever knowing it was gone. Diane Harry, Julie's coworker, had been absolutely right when she told Detective Palmer that she, not Julie, had likely been the intended target of the cyanide poisoning. But it would turn out it was not Roy Fitzpatrick, the man who Diane thought wanted to kill her, who had actually done the poisoning. Instead, it had been Diane's own husband, Louis. It turned out Roy's ex-girlfriend, Verbrae, was not just a friend of Louis's. She was his lover. In fact, they'd been having a secret affair for months when she'd filed the court injunction against Roy. And Louis had been the catalyst behind that decision, hoping it would finally get Roy out of the picture for good. But when Roy began sending those threatening letters, Louis saw a huge opportunity. Investigators believe that Louis wanted out of his marriage, but he didn't want to deal with the hassle and financial burden of a divorce. So he thought he could just murder Diane and frame Roy for it, using those threatening letters as evidence. But it was actually those 7 letters that initially led Detective Palmer to question if Roy really was the man behind the crime that killed Julie. Because those letters were a mix of handwritten and also typed letters. And the final 3, the ones where Roy allegedly started threatening to actually kill Diane, were all typed. So there was no way to prove they'd actually been written by Roy. Roy admitted he had sent letters to Louis and Diane, but he said he had only written 4 of them, and he had only written them by hand. He had not typed any letters. Now, Palmer was not willing to just accept Roy at his word, but he didn't ignore the fact that maybe somebody else had typed and then delivered those final 3 letters, sort of framing Roy. With that in mind, Detective Palmer brought Verbrae in for questioning. And while most of what she said pointed the finger at Roy, there was one thing she told Palmer that helped completely change his mind about the case. Because she said that Louis was actually in the process of divorcing Diane, and that he was already talking to Verbrae about them getting married and starting a family together. But in truth, Louis had not started the divorce process at all, and Diane still truly believed that she and Louis were in a faithful, loving marriage. And the final pieces began to fall into place when Detective Palmer received the log of everyone who had used an ID to get into the office building over the weekend, because one of those ID cards belonged to Diane. But Palmer didn't think Diane was the culprit here. Instead, he saw this as further proof that Louis was the man they were looking for. Clearly, he had used his wife's ID card to sneak into the building. And so when they searched Louis's office where he worked, Palmer found a notepad, and it was filled with handwritten drafts of the final 3 typed threatening letters that focused on killing Diane. And then also, one of Palmer's investigators found something in Louis's office trash can, and it was a receipt from a chemical company that appeared to be for the purchase of cyanide. During this whirlwind investigation, Detective Palmer also came to learn that Louis had actually first attempted to murder his wife when they were at home by putting cyanide in her scotch. But when the amount of cyanide he used in her scotch just made Diane feel sick for a night, he completely rethought his plan, and he decided killing Diane at work would make it far easier for him to cast suspicion on Roy, even if it meant killing other people in the process. Louis Harris was found guilty of first-degree murder as well as multiple counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a chance of parole after 95 years. On a warm morning in July of 1982, 42-year-old Daniel Martinez woke up in his small apartment in San Jose, California. Next to him, his girlfriend Kathy slept with her head on his shoulder. Light poured in through the window, and it made Daniel groan, and he closed his eyes. He and Kathy had gotten high on heroin the night before, and now he felt way more hungover than usual. Daniel remembered that the heroin he had shot up last night burned like red-hot lava as he injected it into his vein. Within seconds, he had felt this amazing high, but along with the expected feelings of euphoria came hallucinations that left him stumbling around and bumping into things. It had also taken him a long time to come down and finally fall asleep. Daniel thought maybe that was why he was feeling so stiff that morning. As he tried to pry his arm out from under Kathy's head, his body felt super heavy. He had to pull his arm really hard, which woke Kathy up. And when Daniel told her how weird he was feeling, she said she felt stiff too. Then she pulled the covers back over her head to go back to sleep. Daniel wanted to lie back down too, But his parole officer told him if he didn't show up for his court appearance that morning, he'd be headed straight back to jail. And so, very slowly, Daniel pulled himself up and shuffled to the bathroom. An hour later, Daniel pulled into the parking lot of the county courthouse. The whole drive, Daniel had struggled just to turn the steering wheel of his old Volkswagen. Now that he was here, he knew he only had 10 minutes to register in the courtroom, so he tried to move quickly. But once he was out of his car, he could barely feel his feet as he walked towards the entrance. He felt so clumsy. It took him multiple tries just to drop his keys into the tray for the metal detector. Daniel did his best to look casual as he walked past the guard. But he stumbled as he passed by and had to grab the conveyor belt just to catch his balance. The guard looked at him suspiciously and asked Daniel if he was intoxicated. Daniel tried to explain that he was sober, but his tongue felt as numb as his feet, and so he slurred when he spoke. And so he was not surprised when the guard took his arm and told him he was under arrest for suspicion of being under the influence, which was a clear parole violation. Daniel knew he was headed to jail. Almost a week later, Daniel sat motionless on his bunk in jail, itching and burning where the weight of his body pressed into the thin mattress. For the past 6 days that he'd been in jail, Daniel had felt his body growing heavier and more rigid. It took him longer and longer to make it to the cafeteria line when it was time to eat, and even when he finally shuffled his way through the line, he dropped his tray at least once per meal. And so the guards started to bring his meals directly to his bunk, but eventually, Daniel couldn't even bend his arms to eat or drink. Finally, the guards brought him soup with a straw, but by that time, his mouth and jaws had started to lock up, and so he couldn't even eat. And on top of that, because his jaw was all locked up, he couldn't really speak. It was just a raspy gasp. Daniel didn't know what was more terrifying, the fact that he couldn't make his body move anymore, or the sinking feeling that nobody was coming to help him. As Daniel sat there motionless on his bed, he heard the heavy metallic sound of the guard's flashlight knocking on his cell door window. Daniel heard the guard then shout out 2 or 3 commands at him, but his body wouldn't respond, so he just sat there motionless. Then Daniel heard the heavy door slide open, and he heard the sound of the guard's boots walking towards him, and then Daniel saw the guard's face as he stared directly into Daniel's wide-open, unblinking eyes. Daniel watched as the hulking guard reached out and gently touched him on the shoulder. And because Daniel was so rigid and couldn't really move his body, as soon as the guard touched him, it was like he became a rocking chair. He just went back and forth on the bunk, more like a piece of wood than a human body. The guard took one more look into Daniel's eyes, and then a moment later pulled out his radio and called for medical help. Later that day, Dr. Owen Green examined the middle-aged man who now lay shackled to the gurney in the emergency room of the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center. Dr. Green checked his watch and noted that the man, Daniel Martinez, had stared straight ahead without blinking for at least 3 straight minutes. And the rest of his body was motionless too. And not just motionless, but frozen. Dr. Green could barely move the man's legs or arms without applying significant force. Dr. Green wondered if maybe Daniel had been given tranquilizers to keep him docile. So he ordered standard blood tests, and soon enough, he had the results. The tests found no tranquilizers in Daniel's system. Meanwhile, several hours had gone by, and Daniel's frozen state had not changed at all. So the doctor decided to run a few more tests just to make sure Daniel wasn't faking his symptoms to try to get out of jail. Dr. Green picked up the small hammer normally used to tap under a person's kneecap to test their reflexes. But instead of doing that, the doctor turned the hammer over and dragged the pointed side very firmly across the sole of Daniel's left foot. Now, normally, this would elicit a pretty big reaction. It's uncomfortable. But as he did it, Daniel stared straight ahead, giving no reaction. Next, the doctor took Daniel's right hand and dragged the hammer across his fingernails, jamming it into his nail beds. Most people cannot absorb that pain without reacting, but again, Daniel didn't even move. Dr. Green still was not entirely convinced that Daniel wasn't faking this, so he decided to try an extreme test. He asked the nurse to bring him a vial of ammonium carbonate, also known as smelling salts. He broke open the capsule and waved it directly under Daniel's nose. Now, most people, when exposed to smelling salts with it right under your nose, will instantly gasp for oxygen as their nose fills with the most irritating ammonia vapors. But Daniel didn't even cough. At this point, Dr. Green knew Daniel could not be faking his symptoms. Something was clearly very wrong with Daniel, and he needed to be seen by a specialist. A week later, Dr. Kenneth Schuster, the hospital's head of neurology, walked into an exam room to check up on Daniel. As Dr. Schuster entered the room, Daniel lay propped up in bed. He stared straight ahead, his mouth slightly open. His arms were bent and frozen at his sides. Dr. Schuster had been asked to help make sense of Daniel's symptoms. Many other doctors had tried to diagnose Daniel, but so far, nobody had an answer. By this point, Daniel basically could not speak at all, so as a result, it was impossible to get a clear medical history from him. And even though Dr. Schuster could see clear track marks on Daniel's arms, indicating a history of intravenous drug use, he didn't know of any drug, legal or otherwise, that could cause a man to freeze like this. So, the doctors could not agree whether Daniel's problems were from a psychological problem or caused by a physical condition. Now, the staff psychiatrist had diagnosed Daniel with something called catatonia, which is a condition where someone becomes rigid and mute after some sudden psychological crisis. Considering Daniel appeared to abuse drugs and did have a criminal history, it certainly was not out of the question that maybe he had suffered some kind of severe trauma at some point. But Dr. Schuster was not convinced that catatonia was the right diagnosis here, and so he decided to test this theory by testing Daniel for a particular symptom of catatonia, called waxy flexibility, in which patients can remain in uncomfortable positions indefinitely. Dr. Schuster gently pulled one of Daniel's stiff arms until it was straight over his head. Daniel's arm stayed frozen in the air for about 30 seconds until gravity began to pull it softly down. Dr. Schuster nodded as he timed the process. It took at least 3 minutes for the arm to fully come back down to rest. And so at this point, Dr. Schuster understood why the psychiatrist thought that this meant that Daniel was catatonic. But Dr. Schuster decided to perform some other tests that could show Daniel's problems were not purely psychological. He noticed that Daniel hadn't blinked at all since he had entered the room. And so Dr. Schuster tapped Daniel gently between the eyes. Even people with catatonia will eventually blink if they're tapped in this way, and Daniel did blink. However, most people will stop blinking, even if the tapping continues. But Daniel didn't. He just kept on blinking, which Dr. Schuster knew was a sign of brain damage. And then, after a while, Daniel's eyes suddenly slammed shut. Dr. Schuster asked Daniel to open them, and Daniel didn't. He just sat there with his eyes closed. Dr. Schuster was starting to see that Daniel had a problem in the part of his brain that controls movement. This meant that Daniel's frozen condition was likely caused by an injury or disease in his brain, not by psychological damage from a traumatic life event. Dr. Schuster instructed one of his colleagues, Dr. Ryan Curtis, to move Daniel to the neurobiology unit of the medical center for further treatment. But Dr. Schuster wasn't sure what that treatment would even be. As he ran through the lists of other tests he might want Dr. Curtis to perform, Dr. Schuster wondered how they could even help Daniel at this point. A week later, Dr. Curtis spooned some pudding into Daniel's mouth and watched him slowly swallow. Dr. Curtis had been personally helping feed Daniel the last few days, so it was easier for him to monitor his progress. With a week of around-the-clock hospital care, Daniel was better hydrated, and his nutrition had improved. But the fact was, Daniel was still mostly silent, motionless, and frozen. When Dr. Curtis had finished feeding Daniel, he went to wash his hands in the sink. Afterward, as he stood there drying his hands, Dr. Curtis's eye caught a glint of light reflected on Daniel's fingernail. Then, another little flash from another fingernail. Slowly, faintly, Daniel's fingers were moving. Dr. Curtis realized Daniel was intentionally moving his fingers. This was not just a reflex. Dr. Curtis grabbed a pen from his pocket and a pad of paper from the nurse's station. Then he went over to Daniel and put the pen in his hand and began to wrap Daniel's fingers around the pen. And he was shocked when he saw Daniel begin to grip it. Once Daniel had the pen, Dr. Curtis asked Daniel to write his name on the pad. Slowly, Daniel's hand began to move over the page, and at first it just looked like a squiggly mark, but over the next 5 minutes, Daniel was able to slowly write out his name. Dr. Curtis called for Dr. Schuster to come witness Daniel's progress. Over the next half hour, the two doctors watched as Daniel wrote 3 more short lines. Daniel wrote that he was aware that his body was not working, but he didn't know why. Dr. Curtis was thrilled to see that Daniel's mind was working inside of his frozen body. And so as Dr. Curtis made a few notes of his own, Dr. Schuster began asking Daniel questions, and with each answer, he began to piece together a history of Daniel's health. And so Dr. Schuster asked Daniel to tell him what kind of medicine or drugs he was taking. And Daniel wrote one word in big letters: heroin. When he saw this, Dr. Curtis shook his head. He and Dr. Schuster both knew that heroin, as harmful as it was to the human body, couldn't cause the extreme symptoms Daniel was suffering from. So Dr. Schuster rephrased the question. Had Daniel been prescribed any medicine by a doctor? Dr. Curtis then helped Daniel hold the pad steady as Daniel scrawled one more shaky word: no. Over the next few hours, Dr. Curtis and Dr. Schuster put together the rest of Daniel's story. They went over every detail of the night 2 weeks earlier when Daniel's body first began to freeze. They covered the drugs, the hallucinations, everything. And then Daniel wrote down something that stopped both doctors in their tracks. Daniel wrote that his girlfriend, Kathy, had also woken up feeling stiff the same way Daniel had on that terrible morning this all began. But he hadn't seen or heard from Kathy since then. Dr. Schuster immediately rushed to the phone and called the police to request an immediate welfare check at Daniel's address. He could only hope that Kathy was still alive. Several days later, Dr. Schuster pulled into his parking space at the hospital and took the back elevator to the neurobiology unit. It was finally time to give Kathy an examination. When the police had done that welfare check at Daniel's apartment, Kathy had not been there. It would turn out she was staying with her family. However, it took Dr. Schuster making many phone calls to the family to convince them to bring Kathy to the hospital, even though they knew something was wrong with her. But eventually, her sister had finally brought her in, and today, the sister was by Kathy's side as Dr. Schuster entered the room. Immediately, Dr. Schuster could see that Kathy was in the same frozen state as Daniel was. Kathy's sister wiped Kathy's mouth with a cloth as she told the doctor how her sister had come home that morning 2 weeks ago, stumbling and slurring her speech. The family had rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors there had refused to admit her for what they assumed was drug intoxication. Kathy's sister was outraged, but she was afraid that if she made a scene, Kathy might be arrested, so she brought Kathy home. Since then, the entire family had taken care of Kathy around the clock and prayed she would just snap out of this. Dr. Schuster told the women that his best guess as to what was happening to Kathy, which also clearly was happening to Daniel, must have started on the same day, that whatever happened to both of them at the same time. Maybe they accidentally ate something toxic, a pesticide perhaps. Maybe there was a carbon monoxide leak in the furnace, or they had some other chemical exposure in Daniel's apartment. Dr. Schuster said he didn't want to rule anything out at this point. And so in order to figure out this mystery, Dr. Schuster convinced the sister to let him admit Kathy to the hospital. That way, at a minimum, she could get the basic care that she needed. A few days later, Dr. Curtis took the short drive down to Santa Cruz, where a fellow neurologist was throwing a party. Once he got inside, he was happy to see some old friends. But it wasn't long before he and his neurologist friend were back to talking medicine. Dr. Curtis wanted to discuss Daniel and Kathy's strange symptoms, but first, his friend wanted to tell Dr. Curtis about a strange case he was working on. He described 2 patients he had seen in a local emergency room the week before. They were brothers who lived in Watsonville, about 50 miles from San Jose. They were 2 healthy young men in their 20s who had been found in their apartment by their mother. Both men were completely frozen, unable to move or talk. Dr. Curtis couldn't believe what he was hearing. His friend was describing Daniel and Kathy's symptoms exactly. He found himself nodding when his friend said that he thought these 2 brothers had the symptoms of a neurological disease called Parkinson's, which can make muscles rigid and slow-moving. Dr. Curtis had discussed the possibility of Parkinson's with Dr. Schuster, but they both agreed that a Parkinson's diagnosis could not possibly be correct for Daniel and Kathy. Parkinson's developed slowly, and Daniel and Kathy had gotten sick literally overnight. What's more, Parkinson's disease is not contagious, but both Daniel and Kathy fell ill at the exact same time. So diagnosing Daniel and Kathy with Parkinson's, it just didn't make any sense. Dr. Curtis's friend felt the same way about his 2 patients. Then he added an odd detail about these two brothers that he found interesting, although he didn't know if it was related to the disease they were suffering from. He said both of the brothers were longtime heroin users. Dr. Curtis knew that Daniel and Kathy were also heroin users, but he'd never heard of heroin making people frozen. But 4 frozen heroin addicts could not be a coincidence. Even though it was very late, he asked his friend for the phone and called Dr. Schuster immediately. After sharing this new information with Dr. Schuster, Dr. Curtis could hear the concern rising in his colleague's voice as he made the link. What if a poisoned batch of heroin was circulating around Northern California and it somehow caused these Parkinson's-like symptoms? If the heroin was to blame, they could have a serious public health disaster on their hands. First, they needed to track down some heroin from the same batch and test it right away. And second, they had to warn heroin users that there could be a deadly poison on the streets. A week later, Dr. Schuster flipped through Daniel Martinez's medical records one more time as he sat on hold with the San Jose Police Crime Lab. As a headache began to settle in between his eyes, he caught a glimpse of his face reflected in the small window of his office. It was late, and he looked as tired as he felt. He hadn't gotten a full night's sleep since Dr. Curtis woke him up last week with the news about the 2 frozen brothers. After the hospital put out a press release about the potentially poisoned drugs, the local media had picked up the story. By the end of the week, Dr. Schuster had found himself in a room full of cameras explaining the situation to reporters from all over the state. As a result of all this coverage, 2 other cases had been discovered, bringing the total number of frozen patients to 6. In between seeing patients and running the clinic, Dr. Schuster had acquired samples of the heroin each of the patients had injected, and sent the samples to the crime lab for analysis. Just then, the hold music paused, and Dr. Schuster finally heard the familiar voice of the crime lab's lead toxicologist, Sabrina Davis. As Sabrina read the test results, Dr. Schuster sat up in his chair, completely stunned. She told him all 6 patients had injected the exact same chemical, but that chemical was not heroin. However, she said she wasn't actually sure what this chemical was, and it would take time to figure that out. Dr. Schuster thanked Sabrina for all the hard work and asked her to keep on searching. And he was about to hang up the phone when Sabrina suddenly said she had one more idea. She suggested that he track down an article in an obscure medical journal that reminded her of this case. It described a college student from the 1970s who had been found paralyzed in his parents' basement in Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. Schuster jotted down the name of the journal, thanked Sabrina again, and then hung up the phone. The next day, Dr. Schuster found a copy of the article, and after he finished reading it, he finally understood what was happening to these 6 frozen patients, and the answer had been staring them in the face the whole time. It would turn out Daniel, Kathy, and the 4 other frozen patients had all been poisoned by a bad batch of something that was brand new at the time: synthetic heroin. Synthetic street drugs were so unusual that the drug compounds were written about in medical journals like the one Sabrina suggested to Dr. Schuster. That article described the case of a college student who was trying to cook up fake heroin, a compound called MPPP. When the amateur chemist heated the compound at too high a temperature, the heat changed it into a different compound called MPTP. When he injected this bad batch of fake heroin, he froze up and couldn't move. All the symptoms of advanced Parkinson's disease. Daniel, Kathy, and the rest of the other frozen patients got a batch of the same kind of overheated fake heroin. When they injected it, this faulty chemical wreaked havoc on their brains, causing them to develop the same Parkinson's-like symptoms overnight. People with Parkinson's lose certain brain cells that control the brain's ability to produce a crucial chemical called dopamine. Dopamine delivers the brain's messages to the nervous system, telling the body how to move. Without dopamine, people cannot move at all. Usually, it takes Parkinson's victims years for enough of these cells to die off before they notice a change in their motor functions. But scientists found that the fake heroin chemical, MPTP, was able to destroy these brain cells within a week. While there's no cure for Parkinson's, Daniel and the rest of the patients were thankfully able to be treated. They were given a compound called L-Dopa, a medicine that increases the dopamine in the brain, and after just 1 dose, they were already able to start moving their bodies normally again. However, L-DOPA treatment comes with many side effects, and unfortunately, none of the frozen patients made a total recovery. But there was a silver lining to this case. The discovery of this bad batch of heroin, the MPTP compound, for the first time gave researchers a substance that could reliably create a Parkinson's-like effect in a lab setting. Now, scientists can accurately test for new drugs on animals and get them to market much faster. And so as a result, what happened to these 6 people has led to enormous advances in Parkinson's research. In March of 2015, 68-year-old Tamara Samsonova was having renovations done to her home in St. Petersburg, Russia. A friend of hers, 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova, had heard about Tamara's renovations, and she approached her and said, "Do you want to stay with me while that's getting done?" Tamara was very thankful, immediately said yes, and as soon as she moved in, she immediately started picking up the slack by cleaning up the house and doing the dishes, and made sure she always cooked food for her friend because she wasn't able to pay rent. After a couple of weeks, the renovations on Tamara's home were complete, but Tamara didn't want to leave. She was really enjoying living with Valentina, and so she asked Valentina would it be okay if she stayed a little bit longer. Valentina was a little bit reluctant, but did ultimately say, okay, that's fine. A couple of months go by, and Tamara is showing no sign that she plans on leaving Valentina's home anytime soon, and Valentina is getting increasingly frustrated with that reality. Finally, in late July 2015, Valentina confronts Tamara and says, "You gotta go." And Tamara just says, "No, I'm not leaving." This causes a huge fight, but at the end of it, Tamara still doesn't leave. So for a couple of days, the women just do not speak to each other. The silence is finally broken on July 23rd when the women get into a fight about some empty cups in the sink that one of them was supposed to clean, but they didn't, and they fought about whose responsibility it was to do the dishes. And then of course the whole subject comes up again of Valentina saying, "You shouldn't even be here, you need to leave." And Tamara's like, "No, I'm not gonna leave." And so another big blowout fight happens. But at the end of this fight, Tamara finally concedes and says, "Okay, I get it, I need to leave, just give me a couple of days and I'll be out of your hair." Immediately, the tension is gone in the room, they're no longer fighting, and Valentina is happy that she's finally going to get her apartment back, and Tamara says, "Look, I'll make us dinner tonight, I'll go out and get some food." Tamara leaves the apartment and goes to a pharmacy and gets a whole bunch of sleeping pills, and then she gets the ingredients to a particular salad that she knows Valentina really likes. She goes back, she starts making dinner, and as she's making this salad, she crushes up the sleeping pills and mixes the powder with the salad dressing and gives that to Valentina. And Valentina, who's very hungry, eats the whole salad and doesn't notice anything is wrong. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had eaten the entire salad, Tamara just goes up to her room and goes to bed. A couple hours later, at about 2 a.m, she goes back down to the kitchen and she sees Valentina is passed out on the ground. Tamara goes up to her and sees that she's still breathing, which was a disappointment because she wanted her to die from taking all these sleeping pills. But it doesn't matter. She takes out her hacksaw that she had borrowed from the neighbor earlier in the day and proceeds to butcher Valentina. And she makes special care as she's cutting her into pieces to remove her lungs and not damage them, because Tamara had a taste for human lungs. It was actually her favorite food. She took Valentina's head and she put it into a big pot of water and began boiling that to eat it. The rest of her was cut up into as small of pieces as she could get them, and then wrapped in a shower curtain and placed in various bags. As Valentina's head and lungs are being cooked on the stovetop, Tamara begins making dozens of trips from the apartment, down the stairs, out the front door, all the way down to the lake that was near their property, where she would dispose of the body parts before coming back and getting more. Valentina's hips and legs were apparently too heavy to haul all the way down to the lake, so she took them to a nearby forest. Tamara's final trip sees her carrying a big silver pot, inside of which is Valentina's head, or at least whatever is left of it after Tamara was done eating most of it. 4 days later, on July 27th, a young couple that was living in the same apartment complex as Tamara and Valentina were out for a walk with their dog out near that lake. And as they're walking, their dog takes off running and stops in front of this huge bag that it's sniffing and pawing and trying to open. And the owners of the dog try to call it back, but they can't get it to get away from this bag. And so the owners walk over and they kind of poke the bag. They can see it's pretty heavy, and they open it up and they find a human torso, and it's Valentina's. When the police show up, the first thing they do is they go to Valentina's apartment, and they're surprised to find Tamara living there. They're kind of sensitive with her, and they say, your friend, your relative, was just found deceased, and we need to look around the apartment. Tamara was completely indifferent. She did not care. They had just discovered her body, and she didn't care that they were searching the apartment. It was like she knew someday this was going to happen. During the search, the police officers quickly find blood all over the bathroom and in the kitchen. They even find the hacksaw she used that's got blood on it. And they find Tamara's diary that's sitting next to this book about black magic. And the police are horrified when they see that the diary contains meticulous notes that Tamara had kept of all of the ritualistic killings she had perpetrated over the past 20 years. And there was 14 of them. And almost all of them were motivated by Tamara's desire to cast spells that she apparently was reading about in these black magic books she had. And virtually all of these spells required human flesh or other human components. And so she would kill these people, she would use their bodies to cast these spells, and then afterwards she would consume them. Not because that had anything to do with the spell, but because she liked the way people tasted, in particular human lungs. The police arrest Tamara, who doesn't put up a fight, and she says, yep, you got the right person, I did all this. While Tamara was on trial, she seemed like she was in a great mood. She told the judge, I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison. She was seen blowing kisses to reporters. It was like she was just totally out of touch. Or maybe she literally knew this was going to happen and just didn't care anymore. Tamara, who would be nicknamed the Granny Ripper by newspapers over the course of this trial, was given a life sentence, and to this day, she is still sitting in jail.
Our next story is called Reign of Terror.
On December 18th, 1956, a brand new game show called To Tell the Truth aired on a major American television network. The premise of the show was relatively simple. 4 celebrity judges would be presented with 3 people called contestants who all claimed to be the same person. And this person who they claimed to be was always remarkable in some way. They had some incredible talent or some crazy job, or they had accomplished something extraordinary. One of these 3 contestants was the real person they were claiming to be. The other 2 people were doing their best to pretend to be that person. And it was the job of the celebrity judges to try to figure out who was telling the truth. So for a set amount of time on the show, the celebrity judges would ask the contestants questions about their background and try to figure out, who was who. And then at the end of the time, the celebrities would cast a vote about who they thought was the real remarkable person. After the votes were tallied up, the host would have the real remarkable person stand up to reveal themselves, and the entire audience would go crazy, and that was the show. And the show became quite popular. So popular, in fact, that today, nearly 70 years later, it's still on the air. And over this show's very long history, virtually all the episodes are pretty similar. It's a pretty redundant show. But there is one episode that will forever go down as the most unique. In October of 1972, 3 contestants walked out onto the stage in front of the 4 celebrity judges, and they all introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. Then the host of the show read aloud the biography of the real Ed Edwards. And he would say that Ed at one point was on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in America for crimes like armed robbery and impersonating a federal officer. And then after he was finally caught by law enforcement and went to prison, a prison guard helped him turn his life around. And then upon release from prison 14 years later, Ed remained this reformed criminal and became a successful author and motivational speaker who specialized in telling people how to identify con men and criminals and how to protect themselves from these people. After the real Ed Edwards biography was read aloud, the 3 contestants sat down and the celebrity judges began asking them questions about their past. And then after the time was up, the celebrities cast their votes, and then the real Ed Edwards was revealed. And even though 2 of the 4 celebrity judges had correctly identified the right Ed Edwards, the crowd was totally astonished at who this guy actually was, because he did not look like this ex-convict. He looked like this kind of all-American, middle-aged father who was totally harmless and wouldn't hurt a fly. But either way, the show ended, and then the world forgot about Ed Edwards. Until 2009. That year, Ed's estranged daughter, 40-year-old April Blasio, finally decided to investigate something that had plagued her for her whole childhood. Despite her father's claims that he was this reformed criminal and this stand-up, law-abiding guy, she didn't believe it. She never believed it. She thought he had never been reformed and just was a criminal and always had been. Behind closed doors, Ed was violent and abusive, and he was a compulsive liar. She remembered in the 1970s and 80s when she was a young kid, Ed would make their family pack up and move sometimes in the middle of the night, and April always assumed it was because her dad was wrapped up in something criminal. But every time she asked him, he would say, oh, well, I was an informant when I was in jail and I snitched on some people, and some of those people figured out where we live, and so we gotta move. April knew he was lying, but there was nothing she could do, and so they just kept on moving around. But she always thought something else was going on. So in 2009, when April is now this 40-year-old woman, she's laying in bed one night and finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna start Googling some stuff. So she hops in her laptop and she starts typing in the different names of towns that she and her family lived in as a kid. And then after she'd write the name of the town, she'd write unsolved mystery or unsolved crime, and she would see if anything popped up. And so as she began looking, she found one in 1980. It was an unsolved murder in a town called Watertown, Wisconsin, that happened right around the time that her family very briefly lived in this town. There was this young teenage couple that had left this wedding, and they had driven down this dead-end road, and they were just kind of enjoying each other's company, when an unknown assailant, who matched the description of Ed Edwards, walked up to their car, broke in, shot them both to death, and then disappeared. And so on a hunch, April called the Watertown Police Department the following day and told them that, I think my father might have been responsible for this double homicide. It's just a hunch, but he matches the description. We were there in this very small window of time when it happened. And so the police said, okay, we'll go have a look. And so the Watertown police, they tracked down Ed Edwards, who was living in Kentucky at the time, and they got him to give them a DNA sample. And when they tested the DNA sample, it matched these samples that were taken at the crime scene in 1980. And so Ed Edwards, he was arrested and brought back to Wisconsin, and as soon as he was in custody, he confessed to the murder. And then he requested the death penalty, but he was told the maximum punishment for this crime was life in prison. Ed didn't like this, and so he confessed to another double homicide from 1977 in Ohio, where he killed another teenage couple, thinking that would give him the death penalty. But through a loophole, they said, well, actually, that still won't get you the death penalty. You're still facing life in prison. And so frustrated, Ed revealed a third murder he had perpetrated. In 1996, he had killed his own foster son for the insurance money. And so for this crime, he was eligible for capital punishment, and so he was sentenced to death. But he would die of natural causes 2 years later in 2011 before the state could execute him. Since his death, cold case investigators and members of his own family have theorized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for more killings beyond just the 5 he happened to confess to. In fact, many people believe Ed Edwards could actually be the infamous Zodiac Killer, who's one of the nation's most notorious uncaught serial killers that killed 37 people in Northern California in the 1960s and 1970s. If this is true, then Ed Edwards did not become a killer after he was on that game show in 1972. No, when he showed up for that game show and stood in front of the audience and smiled and answered questions to the celebrity panelists, at that time, as you're watching him on TV, he would have already been a seasoned serial killer with dozens and dozens of victims. But Ed stopped confessing to murders after that third confession because he was just kind of using those murders as bargaining chips to get what he wanted, the death penalty. And once he got it, he went silent. And now that he's dead, we're never going to get another confession out of him. And there's no proof connecting him to any unsolved murder cases. And so unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll ever know the full extent of Ed's reign of terror.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Inside Scoop.
In the early evening of May 7th, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zivana Temolkoska walked around her kitchen inside of her apartment in the little southeastern European city of Kisevo. Kisevo is a quiet place at the base of this huge mountain in northern Macedonia, and while it's totally beautiful, it's utterly remote, and basically nothing really of note happens here. Zivana cleaned houses for a living, but on this particular day, she was on a day off, and so she was just kind of hanging out at her apartment, waiting for her adult son, named Zoran, to come home. It was a beautiful, warm evening that night, and so Zivana had the windows in the kitchen open as she walked around making herself something to eat, and at some point as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring. And so she grabbed it and answered, and she heard the sound of her friend on the other line. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and very uncomfortable, and she was asking Zivana if she was paying attention to the news right now. Did she have the radio on or the TV? And Zivana was like, no, why? And the friend would tell her that all over the news right now, there was this huge, terrible traffic accident that had happened in their town, and unfortunately, Zivana's son, Zoran, who she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in this accident. Zivana let out a strangled cry when she heard this, and then just dropped what she was using to make food and turned and ran out the door. And when she did, her neighbor who was outside saw her emerge and yelled out to her, hey, is everything okay? And Zivana, as she literally just continued running towards the road, she basically blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. And this neighbor watched as Zivana just ran down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared. Zivana did not have a car of her own, and so literally she was going to run to the hospital to make sure her son was okay. A little while later, that same neighbor who had just watched Zivana disappear around the corner heard a knock on their door. And so the neighbor went to the door, they opened it up, and they were totally shocked at who they saw standing outside. It was Zivana's son, Zoran, who did not appear to be hurt in any way. But before the neighbor could ask any questions about this, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, said to the neighbor, hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going. The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, having no idea what was going on here, and then the neighbor was like, well, wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident? And Zoran's like, no, what are you talking about? And then the neighbor kind of filled Zoran in about how they had seen his mother run outside, and she had mentioned how her son had been in this car accident, and she literally ran to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was, and so Zoran just grabbed his phone and called the hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital picked up, they would tell Zoran that his mother was not there, she had not been there all day, and two, even though they had heard reports about this car accident in town, there had not been any car accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. And so by the end of that night, when Zoran really had no idea what had happened to his mom, where she was, or, what was going on with this car accident thing, he just did the only thing he could think to do, which was go to the police and report his mother missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, when still Zivana was missing and the police had no idea what happened to her, there were no new leads, nothing, on this day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Teneski, who actually happened to live not that far away from where Zivana lived, he got a call from one of his police sources. And the source would tell him that Zivana had actually just been found, even though this was not public information, and unfortunately, Zivana was dead. Her body, which had been beaten and strangled and stabbed, had been found wrapped up in plastic and dumped in this illegal dumping area not far from the town's football stadium. The source told Vlado that when her body was searched, they discovered she still had valuables on her person, and so that kind of ruled out the possibility that this was a robbery gone wrong, which was the initial theory about what they were seeing. However, when police had done an initial probe into Zivana's life to figure out who this victim was, they discovered that she was just this poor old cleaning lady who had no enemies to speak of, and so it really just made no sense that she was the victim of such an obviously brutal and intimate murder that was not financially motivated, at least not on the surface. Vlado thanked his source for all the information and then hung up. Vlado's source had sounded really shocked by this murder as he was telling Vlado, but now, as Vlado was sitting here thinking about what he had just been told, he wasn't really shocked as much as he was suspicious. He felt like something just was off about this murder. Maybe Zavana appeared to be this poor old cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, maybe that wasn't who she was. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she was not supposed to see and that got her killed. Vlado had no idea, but he just felt like, there's something off about this and it needs to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in town for being this very aggressive and kind of fearless journalist who had no problem diving headfirst into some of these really murky stories that could involve corruption or misuse of power, and he would get to the bottom of it, and he would publish these articles where he spoke really critically about the government, about police, about anybody really who was in a position of power. But as a result of conducting himself this way, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many, many times for things he had written or things he was about to write. But even though Vlado knew this Zavana murder case had the potential to once again put him in hot water with the powers that be, he still felt like it was his responsibility to dive into this thing and get to the truth. So, feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, and he walked out the front door of his house, and he made the several-minute-long walk over to Zavana's house. And when he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door, and a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen talking about what had happened. Zoran told Vlado all about how he came home and discovered his mom wasn't there, and then he went to the neighbor's house, and they explained how, they had seen Zavana running off to the hospital to go look for Zoran, but Zoran's like, I'm not hurt, I didn't get into a car accident, what's going on here? And as Zoran spoke, Vlado took lots of notes and asked lots of follow-up questions, and by the end of this interview, when Vlado felt like he knew everything there was to know about Zavana, he felt like he actually had a pretty good working theory as to what actually happened to Zavana. And the reason he felt like his theory could be accurate had to do with what Zoran told Vlado his mother did for a living, that she was a cleaning lady. Now, it took Vlado a couple of days to put together his story. He had to go out and interview dozens more people in the neighborhood. But finally, on May 19th, so just 3 days after Zavana was found murdered, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. And the story's explosive headline read, "A Serial Killer Stalks Kosovo." In the story, Vlado says that Zavana's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, her murder was likely linked to 2 other murders of 2 other women. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zavana, literally. They were poor older women who were also cleaning ladies. And so that was why when Vlado was talking to Zoran and Zoran described how his mother was, what she did for work, what she looked like, that Vlado started to remember these other victims and he put it all together. The other 2 victims were 64-year-old Mitra Simjanowska, who was murdered in 2005, and the other victim was 56-year-old Lubitsa Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Now, Vlado's story was totally explosive because what he's saying is that there is a serial killer that is on the loose in this town. But this story was also highly explosive because Vlado spoke very critically about the police who were involved in this investigation. Specifically, he pointed out that the 05 and 07 murders of those 2 other women, those had been totally mishandled because arrests had been made in at least one of those cases, and clearly whoever they arrested was innocent here. And so the police just totally dropped the ball, at least in Vlado's opinion. And when the police read Vlado's story, they were very upset at him because he was so critical of them. However, the police also did see that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from all of his interviews with witnesses and people in the neighborhood that did seem to paint a picture of this potentially really being a serial killer, not individual isolated killings. And so the police, based on Vlado's story, would actually begin investigating a serial killer in their midst. They linked all 3 murders, and they began basically a new investigation. However, at the same time they began this new investigation, Vlado began to notice that he was being tailed all the time by police. He would be out in town doing his job, reporting and interviewing people, and there'd just be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance watching him. But Vlado had anticipated that no matter what, he was likely going to face some sort of blowback from the police, and so he just kind of accepted that they were going to watch him and maybe try to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to bother him because he had done his job, he had reported the story the best that he could, and if they wanted to watch him from a distance, they could do that. By early June, so about 2 weeks after Zavana had been found murdered, the police, in this new serial killer investigation they were doing, had narrowed down their suspect pool, which was in the hundreds, down to just 3 people. And they felt like they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, so by this point Vlado is still being trailed by police all the time, but the police have not come out publicly and said anything about the serial killer case. They're just continuing their investigation. But on this day, June 20th, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer telling the editor they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. And as soon as their conversation ended, the editor called Vlado to tell him the news. But when he called Vlado, Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. And the editor was also thinking to himself how strange it was that this officer had contacted him and not Vlado. Like, why aren't you going to the guy writing the stories and telling him about this new development? Why are you coming to me? The editor would continue to try calling Vlado several more times, but Vlado never answered. And so ultimately, the editor just kind of assumed that Vlado must be busy, interviewing someone, or maybe more likely, he had already learned about this imminent arrest, and he was on scene ready to capture in real time this arrest that was about to take place. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, the police had surrounded this very modest 2-story home that was very overgrown out front. It was surrounded by tall fir trees, and all the windows had heavy drapes covering them up. And then once the police felt like they had totally surrounded this building, a team of officers walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door and yelled out that they were police, and whoever was inside, come out with their hands up. And for a moment, it was just silent and tense. And then the police on the porch heard footsteps inside the house. They had their guns ready to go. And then the door slowly opened up. And this man, who seemed very unthreatening and kind of confused, stepped out onto the porch. And the police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper headquarters, Vlado's editor got another phone call. And when he answered, it was the same police officer who had called before to warn him about this upcoming arrest. Except this time, the officer was calling to say the arrest had been made, they had caught their serial killer, and then he told the editor the name of the person they arrested. And when the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado. It would turn out that Vlado appeared very professional and calm on the outside, but inside, he was full of rage, specifically at his mother, who he viewed as this terrible, cruel person. And after she died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with this idea of getting revenge on his deceased mother. And the way he decided he would do that would be by killing random women who just kind of looked and seemed an awful lot like his mother. i.e., they were poor, older, and cleaning ladies. His 3 victims, Mitra in 2005, Lubitsa in 2007, and Zavana in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. And so Vlado had actually used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust, and then once he had their trust, he would lure them away to strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In Vlado's explosive newspaper story, he lied about a whole bunch of things just to throw the police off. Like, for example, he made up that he spoke to a witness who claimed to have seen Zavana get into a car with 2 men right before she vanished. Vlado did not see that. That was just a total lie designed to confuse the police. Vlado had also been the one to plant that story on the radio about Zavana's son, Zoran, being in this terrible accident. That had caused Zavana to run out of her house and be vulnerable to be scooped up and killed, which is exactly what Vlado wanted. He had called the radio station and told them about this accident, and because he had previously worked for that radio station, they believed him without doing any fact-checking and broadcast the story. And so really that whole radio broadcast was just a very intentional trap by Vlado to kill Zavana. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was in the article he wrote, he left in some really specific details that the police had not revealed to the public. And so basically by including these in the story, it meant Vlado had an inside scoop into what was really going on. Like, for example, Vlado said that all 3 of these women who had been killed by the serial killer had been strangled to death by telephone cords that were left at the scene. But again, the police had not revealed that to the public, and so when they read the story, they actually became very suspicious of Vlado and thought he could be involved in these murders. And so when Vlado felt like the police were trailing him just to intimidate him, in reality, the police were trailing Vlado because they thought he could be the murderer, and eventually, when they got a DNA sample from Vlado, it was confirmed that their suspicions were right. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and the police were getting ready to charge him with the 3rd, and they were even looking at a 4th victim, potentially, that maybe Vlado had killed as well, but they weren't entirely sure yet. But on June 23rd, so just 3 days after Vlado's arrest, he died in jail in a way that really didn't make any sense. Vlado had drowned in a small bucket of water inside of his jail cell, while there were 3 other people inside of that jail cell with him who all said they didn't notice it happening. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide, and after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen's Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studio